Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 500, and I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Got a lot to talk about on today's show. In fact, I have so much news today that I decided to put out a fourth episode this week. And so Connor Freeman, the co-host of the show, will be here with an episode tomorrow. Myself and Connor are actually covering for Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So we have quite a few articles between the two of us to get through. And so rather than doing one show that may verge on an hour and a half to 2 hours, I figured I'd break it into two. So this first show that'll be out normal time on Friday is going to be mostly Gaza news, and then the Saturday show will be Russia, China, and West Bank news. So a lot of important stuff to talk about here. Didn't want to miss anything, and so you guys will get a bonus show this week, so you get everything. Just be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version, and is up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And of course, follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. All right, let's get into the news today. And the first story I have here, I wrote for antiwar.com on November 16th. Israel tells Palestinians to evacuate city in southern Gaza. So Israeli aircraft dropped leaflets on a city in southern Gaza instructing Palestinians to flee the area. The Vistria notice suggests that Tel Aviv plans to ramp up its military operations in South Gaza, and the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant confirmed that a ground invasion of the area would happen at some point. In the first days of the Israeli military operation, it instructed Palestinians to flee to the southern half of the besieged enclave. At the time, human rights groups warned the forced displacement of the million people who live in the northern half of the Gaza Strip would create a humanitarian crisis. The Norwegian Refugee Council slammed Tel Aviv, calling the evacuation order a war crime of forcible transfer. As the Israeli onslaught in Gaza concludes its week, the northern half of the strip has been decimated. While South Gaza has been bombed, Israel's ground operations have been limited to the north. The UN estimates that of the 2.3 million people that live in Gaza, 1.5 million have been displaced. Around half of the population of the strip are children. Over 11,000 Palestinians have already been killed, including 4,500 children. Tel Aviv says 50 Israeli soldiers have been killed during ground operations inside of Gaza. Now Tel Aviv appears ready to turn its focus to the south. The Israeli Air Force dropped leaflets on Wednesday night in eastern areas of Khan Younis. It's a city in southern Gaza, actually the largest city in southern Gaza, ordering people to leave their homes or in shelters for their own safety. The leaflet suggests an invasion of South Gaza will begin soon. Gallant, again, that's the Israeli defense minister, said the ground operations will eventually, quote, include both north and south. We will strike Hamas wherever it is. However, he did not indicate when his forces would enter the southern half of the strip. Some Palestinians sheltering in Khan Younis fled northern Gaza last month. The UN explains that it has been evacuating patients from the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City, which is in the northern half of the strip, to a hospital in Khan Younis. According to the Associated Press, it's not clear what plan the Israelis have in place for where the Palestinians should go. The AP reports, this is in the AP, it's not clear where they should go, as Egypt refuses to allow mass transfer onto its soil. And of course, I hate this, and I talk about this all the time, how to Americans, and particularly to American conservatives, Republicans, they see this as some kind of evidence that there's something wrong with the Palestinians, and they deserve to have the Israelis do to them whatever they're going to do, because, of course, if you have a Muslim population, and it's not all Muslims, there are quite a few Christians that do live in Gaza, but From, the perspective of Americans, they're all Arabs, and most of them are Arab Muslims. And so if you had this population of Arab Muslims that the Egyptians won't take in, well, then there has to be something wrong with them, because aren't these people all Arab Muslims anyway? So why don't they all just live in the same country? This is, typically the view that Tel Aviv really tries to instill in Americans, and a lot of them have bought onto it. Now, there's a couple really important points to make here. One is that the Palestinians want to live in Palestine and not Egypt. And so, from the perspective of Cairo, and I don't necessarily mean this is necessarily the belief of the Egyptian military dictator who rules his country with an iron fist. I'm not sure that he cares about the Palestinians at all, but there are a lot of people in Egypt who do, and they put pressure on their government to make sure that Egypt does not participate in the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians of Gaza. And so if Egypt was out there saying that, yeah, Israel, you could push all the Palestinians into the Sinai as long as we get some money for it, we really don't care, then I think that would probably be maybe not all the international cover that Israel needs to be able to do this, because I'm sure the Americans would get on board with the plan and push it as well at the UN. So that could really greenlight an Israeli ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza if Egypt signed on to this. And so they refuse it for the benefit of the Palestinians. And because that is the will of the Palestinians, they don't want to be driven into the Sinai. And so if Egypt opens that border, it's going to greenlight that. So that's one reason Egypt doesn't do it. A second reason, of course, is you don't want to stick 2.3 million people in a refugee camp in a place where it's fairly inhospitable in the Sinai. There's no infrastructure there for all these people. And so it's going to be a humanitarian nightmare for years to come. If you look, and not many people are aware of this, but I believe it's in 2017, maybe 2016, the government of Myanmar, the one that's actually gets overthrown by the military dictatorship, Aung San Suu Kyi, I believe it was the name of the leader who was overthrown. Her government actually carried out a pretty ruthless ethnic cleansing campaign in the northern half of her country. They targeted a group of Muslims that were, I don't think even native. I think it was British colonialism that ended up with all these Muslims living in northern Myanmar. But they are known as an ethnic group called the Rohingya. And they were driven, about 1 million of them, into Bangladesh from Myanmar. And in the 5-6 years since, they've lived in a refugee camp in like I said, southern Bangladesh, I believe. And it's just a nightmare. It constantly floods. There's no permanent infrastructure. There's no real, justice system or anything in place. So I think largely at this point it's ruled by gangs. It's, there's so little infrastructure. People die from being trampled to death by elephants in this particular refugee camp. And so if you look at the outcomes of people who are driven off of their land, it is not good. And so I think, if we look at what's likely to happen to these Palestinians, should the Israeli plan come into place where they're able to drive all the Palestinians out of Gaza, we're looking at just rampant rates of, childhood mortality and things like that, just skyrocketing for the Palestinians. It will not be a good situation for them. And so it's an obvious reason why they reject it. Now, one other thing I want to mention with this article is I think at this point it becomes pretty much a textbook definition of ethnic cleansing, what Israel is doing here, right? They are driving the Palestinians out of Palestine and attacking the northern half of the Gaza Strip. It puts the remaining, the 2.3 million people that live in Gaza and would be shoved into the southern half of the Gaza Strip in an inhospitable position where over time, I think it would certainly either drive out or kill all the Palestinians. And so, I would guess that if Israel ended their military operations right now and just didn't allow construction materials into Gaza, they're essentially going to, over the long term, get what they want here, which is all the Palestinians will have to leave, or they'll end up, dying. And so, but conducting these military operations in southern Yemen, or southern Israel, Gaza, they're just forcing them all out of the Gaza Strip and completely out of what was Palestine. And so, there's really no other way to look at this than at this point than just a straight textbook case of ethnic cleansing. And again, for people to say, "Oh, Kyle, that was obviously happening already," I'm saying that this makes it a very clear-cut textbook case of ethnic cleansing, where you're just looking at the short term, using the military to drive people off of the land that they have historically lived on. All right, so next up here, Dave DeCamp wrote this one for antiwar.com. U.S. tries to deflect blame for Israel's raid of Al-Shifa Hospital. The White House on Wednesday said it did not okay Israel's military raid of the Al-Shifa hospital in northern Gaza in an attempt to deflect responsibility for the attack. Just hours before Israel launched the raid, the White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby bet Israel's claim that Hamas had a command center under the hospital without providing any evidence. Hamas released a statement that said President Joe Biden was fully responsible for the Israeli raid on the hospital, pointing to the intelligence claim. The statement said the White House and the Pentagon's adoption of the false narrative claiming that the resistance is using Al-Shifa's medical complex for military purposes was a green light for the occupation to commit more massacres against civilians. And it's really hard to argue with what Hamas is saying there. Not that, I would have said this regardless of what the Hamas statement said, but I think it's really important to highlight here that they're actually right, that had the U.S. not come out and said that there's probably a Hamas command center under that hospital, the Israelis would have taken such a huge hit in the PR category that they probably wouldn't have carried out that raid. So, despite the unconditional military support for Israel's war, which includes near daily weapon shipments, Kirby denied that the U.S. was responsible for the raid. And so, just imagine this. You're giving somebody weapons every single day on a person-to-person level, right? Like, if your neighbor is a serial killer and every day you sell him a gun and he's a serial killer, right? You're an accomplice in the murder. That's felony murder. You're going to jail forever. And in this case, the U.S. watches Israel commit war crimes day after day after day. I'm just killing tens of thousands of people and injuring tens of thousands of people, ruthless attacks on civilian infrastructure. And they say, yeah, we want them to avoid killing civilians, and here are some more guns to do so. So Kirby said, my delivery of some downgraded information yesterday that the timing of that really came after work by the intelligence community to prepare the information for downgrade. It has nothing to do with any operational timing or decision making by the Israeli Defense Forces, which is just completely stupid. He's saying that, oh, I said this and then the Israeli forces did that, but these two things don't have anything to do with each other. Of course, that's dumb. And only something that people who believe American propaganda would believe anyways. He goes on to say, we did not give an okay to the military operations around the hospital in a similar fashion to the fact that we didn't give the okay to their tactical operations. These are Israeli military operations that they plan and they execute, in accordance with their own established procedures that the United States is not involved with. So we have officials all over Israel, military personnel all over Israel. We're sending generals to Israel to help them plan their military operations. We send them weapons to carry out their military operations. And then when they carry out military operations in a hospital, the U.S. likes to stand here and say, well, we really had nothing to do with that. It's just a complete and stupid lie. Kirby claimed that the attack on the hospital was not a focus of call President Biden held with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Tuesday night. He again bat the Israeli narrative about the hospital, saying the U.S. was comfortable with our intelligence assessment about the degree to which Hamas is using Al-Shifa Hospital as a command control node as a storage facility underneath. there is a significant underground basement underneath the Al-Shifa hospital that was actually built by Israel as a part of an expansion project in the 1980s when it ruled the Gaza Strip. Israeli military reports have previously claimed that Hamas connected its tunnels to the bunker. Now, there is a really great article today. It's on antiwar.com, originally at Consortium News, by Gareth Porter, the great Gareth Porter, just going through and kind of breaking down all the past claims about Hamas using hospitals, and even particularly the Al-Shifa hospital as a command center, and how it's never turned out to be true. And Dave DeCam points out here, which is so important. So far, Israel has failed to produce any evidence to back its claim that Hamas had a command center at the hospital. The Israeli military presented photos of weapons it claims it found at the hospital, which show only 10 rifle, a few magazines, and military vests, nothing indicating a significant command center. And in fact, if you're looking at a hospital in a military zone, where I'm sure fighters have been wounded and have at least sought treatment at that hospital. I'm sure the hospital, demands that they give up their guns and things like that while they're receiving treatment. They don't get to keep those by their bedside. Not only that, but at the hospital, they just buried 180 people in a mass grave. And so they probably don't bury fighters in their uniforms and their guns and things like that. And so it's entirely possible that these 10 guns were, a part of the 700 patients and 180 people, that are at the hospital, that the 180 bodies that were buried, people who are severely wounded, things like that, and have nothing to do with a Hamas command center or gun stash at all. Also, 10 rifles is absolutely nothing and meaningless. This is not a command center. It's actually proof of what the Palestinians and what the people inside the hospital have been saying. So the IDF published a video on as showing a spokesperson walking through the hospital and showing guns and other equipment. The video was later deleted, and edited version was then posted. At the end, the guy points to this laptop and he's like, "Oh, there's a lot of intelligence on there." And in this laptop is in the MRI room, and there's a stack of CDs next to the laptop. Now, anybody with any intelligence whatsoever goes, "Oh, I bet they take the MRIs and download the results onto the CD with this laptop. Boom. Oh, that's what's happening." But nope, because this is an Israeli military official, of course, that laptop is proof of terrorism. We already know. So the end of Dave's article here, Shifa is still full of hundreds of patients whose doctors are warning will continue to die due to the lack of power and other desperately needed resources. Among the patients are dozens of newborn and premature babies who were removed from incubators when the power went out over the weekend. At least 3 of the babies have died. And my understanding is there are basically no functioning hospitals left in Gaza. The Khan Yunis hospital has been down due to a lack of fuel for the past 3 days. And, they're making do, right? Not that these are really functioning and operating hospitals, but the doctors are still there. They're still trying to treat people in whatever way they can. I believe I read this morning that there are no functioning surgery centers at all left in Gaza. People who just, have things, need dialysis, right, are starting to die because of the cruelty here. All right, so next up here, Israel's attack on Shifa Hospital to pressure Hamas into accepting hostage agreement. I was actually shocked that the New York Times reported this. So the New York Times reports Israel attacked the largest hospital in Gaza in hopes the raid would cause Hamas to relent and accept a hostage deal on terms proposed by Tel Aviv. An Israeli official said that if Hamas accepts the agreement, Tel Aviv will resume the war in Gaza after the exchange of captives. The outlet reports, and this is a quote from the New York Times, Israel believes that Wednesday's raid on the Al-Shifa hospital will put pressure on Hamas to finish a deal to trade dozens of Israeli captives for Palestinian prisoners, according to 2 senior Israeli officials. The report continues, Israel believes that by taking Shifa, which it says Hamas uses as a command and control center, and patient and uses its patients as human shields. The militant group is deprived of a key asset and more inclined to trade hostages, according to officials. And so, as mentioned here, what we just went through in the last article, which is that claim has not been proven whatsoever. And in fact, Israel's raid seems to have proved the opposite, that this was more or less a hospital in a war zone that was functioning to the best of its abilities. So the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's eagerness to negotiate a hostage deal is a change in course for Tel Aviv. Vice News reports it spoke with officials who said that Netanyahu initially delayed talks until after Israel was able to invade Gaza with ground forces. And this is from a diplomat in the region that was involved in the hostage negotiation talks, speaking with Vice. It is clear that the Israelis wanted a ground offensive underway before it was considering the hostage release proposal, which has been on the table since the first days of the conflict. The outline of the deal has not changed from the start of talks, but the Israelis in the past few days do appear more receptive. Then, the deal was further postponed because the Israeli prime minister believed he could score a political win by forcing Hamas to make a deal, according to a NATO official. And so this is a NATO official speaking with Vice News. There has been a willingness to consider it by Israel that has not been previously seen. And it there is referring to the hostage deal. Netanyahu can now look at the Israeli public and tell them that his firm action with the ground offensive is what freed some of the hostages. Netanyahu sees a short-term political gain to arguing the offensive forced Hamas into concessions, but he doesn't seem to fear explaining how hostages might have died in airstrikes when the same deal was available, and they're talking about earlier in the war. And so, I mean, think about this series of events that is really wild, right? So in the early days of the war, Israel could have had their hostages freed with a prisoner swap and an agreement for a short 3 to 5 day pause to fighting. However, Netanyahu didn't want that. He wanted to have Israeli forces on the ground so he could make it look like a PR win, that Hamas was pressured into accepting the agreement, or that, Israeli hostages were freed by the Israeli soldiers. And that did not work out. And so then they launched an attack on a hospital to try to pressure Hamas into accepting the agreement. It's just so disgusting. The agreement that is currently under mediation through Qatar would see Hamas release captives taken on October 7th and Israeli release Palestinians held in prisons. The release of children and women will be prioritized. The numbers that I saw floated around were 50 people released by Hamas, and then again prioritizing children, women, and I believe people who are severely injured and who cannot be treated in Hamas are treated in Gaza. My guess is that Hamas probably doesn't see a whole lot of value in having dead captives, and so better to trade someone when they're alive than wait until they've died, and then all you have to trade back is a body, is I'm guessing kind of their perspective. And of course, Israel has thousands of Palestinians that are political prisoners, right? Young kids that are sentenced to draconian jail sentences in military courts for, say, throwing stones at an armored vehicle, or just alleging to have thrown stones in an armored vehicle. A lot of time there's no actual proof. There's no actual trial. And so who knows how many of these kids actually, again, threw a rock at a car, an armored car, and that's what they're in jail for. Additionally, there will be a 3 to 5 day pause in fighting to allow the agreement to unfold. During the halt in fighting, Israel will allow aid into Gaza. Axios reports that the Israeli negotiators have pressed to decrease the length of time of any agreement. So the length of pause for any agreement. In the first initial agreement, I think they were talking about something more moderate as far as how many prisoners would be swapped, maybe 10 on each side, and then there would be a 24-hour pause in the fighting, or a 2-day pause in the fighting, and Israel said they were unwilling to accept anything more than 24 hours. Now they're talking about the release of 50 or more people, and so Hamas is calling for a 5-day ceasefire, and Israel is looking for 3 days. So I just finished up the article here by mentioning some of the stats that I've already mentioned in the past, that, the 1.5 million displaced and 11,000 killed. All right. Next up here, I talked about in the first article how there's a real chance that Israel is going to conduct a ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. And we have human rights warning that Gaza communications blackout can't cover up atrocities. So Human Rights Watch, that's HRW, reported issued a report explaining that the Israeli fuel embargo in Gaza will cause a near total blackout of communications in the besieged strip. The groups warned that the isolation could be used to cover up atrocities. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, said that there needs to be an investigation of extremely serious allegations of multiple and profound breaches of humanitarian law in Gaza. After the Hamas attack in southern Israel on October 7th, Israel has imposed a complete siege of Gaza. Tel Aviv has allowed a small amount of aid to enter the enclave, but the shortages have caused hospitals and other critical facilities to shut down. Human Rights Watch said the next part of the infrastructure to fail will be the communications network. And this is a quote from the Human Rights Watch report. The Israeli government's decision to bar the delivery of fuel to Gaza will trigger a complete communications blackout immediately, if not urgently addressed, further endangering the lives of the Gaza population. Israel should allow desperately needed fuel into Gaza and refrain from deliberately shutting down or destroying telecommunication systems that can cause disproportionate harms to civilians. The organization's senior technology researcher Deborah Brown said the blackout could be exploited to commit undocumented war crimes. Intentional blanket shutdowns or restrictions on access to the internet violate multiple rights and can be deadly during crisis. Prolonged and complete communications blackouts like those experienced in Gaza can provide cover for atrocities and breed impunity while further undermining humanitarian efforts and putting lives at risk. And so just, imagine here that you got 2.3 million people in Gaza that you want to evacuate and move to certain areas so you could carry out your military operations if you're Israel. If those people don't have access to communication, then they're not going to go where to go, and it's going to cause absolute chaos. Now, this is probably what Israel actually wants, but that's not what they say they want. So as Israel began its ground invasion of Gaza on October 27th, its forces disabled communication centers in the strips, causing a 34-hour blackout. Tel Aviv's military operations also knocked out communications in Gaza on November 1st and 5th, according to Human Rights Watch. On Thursday, the UN Human Rights chiefs pushed for an international investigation into war crimes. As bombardment continues by air, intense urban warfare is also underway. In very few hospitals that are still functioning, doctors operate on screaming children without anesthetics, using mobile phones for light. Turk said in a testimony to the UN Security Council. He continued, the World Health Organization has recorded at least 137 attacks on healthcare in Gaza, with especially severe impact on the Al-Shifa hospital in recent days, where newborns are on life support are dying due to power, oxygen, and water cuts, while many other patients of all ages are at risk, as well as medics and people sheltering at the hospital ground. And yet, international humanitarian law requires special protection for medical units at all times so that they can continue their life-saving work. Turk continued, extremely serious allegations of multiple and profound breaches of international humanitarian law. Whoever commits them demand rigorous investigations and full accountability. Where national authorities prove unwilling or unable to carry out such investigations, and where there are contested narratives on particularly significant incidents, international investigation is called for. And so I just really want to highlight something here, that Israel has attacked ambulances attempting to leave the Al-Shifa hospital. The doctors have reported that basically anyone who tries to leave, even if it's to bring in an injured person to the hospital, has been shot and killed. Also, patients have been shot and killed through their windows at the hospital. So It's just horrific. And I do note here that the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has turned the region into a humanitarian catastrophe. Turt says that the death toll counts as 1 in every 57 people in the Gaza Strip have been killed or wounded in the past 5 weeks. So you got 2.3 million people, and about 2% of them have been killed or wounded in 5 weeks. That is uh, unreal numbers. It is also the deadliest conflict for UN staff and journalists in decades, if not ever. They start counting the journalist numbers in the past few years, so it's kind of hard to know for sure, but it's bad. All right, next up here, Netanyahu ally says the prime minister's days in office are numbered. So Benjamin Netanyahu's hold on power in Tel Aviv suffered 2 setbacks on Wednesday. Messages from a member of his Likud party surfaced, asserting Netanyahu's days in office are, quote, numbered. Additionally, the head of the Israeli opposition, that's Yair Lapid, demanded the prime minister resign. So this is Galant Distel Adabarian, a Likud member of the Knesset, said a private telegram message slamming the Israeli prime minister. I have great anger towards Netanyahu. Fury that is burning inside me, she said. The days of his government are numbered, that's completely clear. The Times of Israel describes the Likud member of the Knesset as a firebrand who is seen as a Netanyahu loyalist. She was a member in Netanyahu's government, but resigned in the days following the Hamas attack on southern Israel. So this is a real blow. This would be like, a pretty firm Democrat coming out and saying, like, Biden needs to come out of office. I guess maybe not Schumer or Pelosi, but think of a Chris Murphy or Chris Coons in the Senate. Somebody who you would assume would definitely be on Biden's side, coming out and just absolutely blasting. Now, this wasn't a private telegram message that was leaked, I guess, but still, again, that this is being said by people who are considered Netanyahu loyalists is, I think, a real sign that he may be on his way out pretty soon. In a second blow to Netanyahu, Lapid demanded his resignation on Israeli Channel 12. He said, "This government isn't functioning. We need change. Netanyahu cannot continue to be prime minister. We cannot allow ourselves to conduct a prolonged military campaign with the prime minister that the public has no faith in. Security-wise and on the society level, we cannot have a premier who has lost the trust of the public." And again, this isn't, me just trying to say that, oh, Lapid is right. I don't like this Israeli politician. I think he's, trying to maybe even put in a more extreme government than the one headed by Netanyahu. But he is right. A poll conducted by the Bar Ilan University released this week shows that less than 4% of Jewish Israelis trust Netanyahu. So Lapid said that he is willing to work with members of Netanyahu's Likud to oust the leader. We will sit in government under another candidate from the Likud, he said. Lapid claimed to have spoken with members of Likud and, quote, there are many people who understand the country is going to a bad place. He added Netanyahu needs to go now during the fighting. And so I think maybe that's something that's important here, that Lapid is not trying to call for an end to this war or anything like that. He's not saying what my country is doing is morally disgusting and I don't want to be a part of it. He's just saying that the people of Israel don't trust Netanyahu, and that's becoming a real issue right now. And again, I'm guessing that he would prefer the country take a more aggressive position. Now, a couple things. Netanyahu will fight very hard to hang on to power. Him being the prime minister is probably the only thing that's keeping him out of jail. There are multiple corruption cases against Netanyahu and his wife that seem to have a lot of evidence, and he's basically forced his way to be the prime minister and set up governments in Israel to keep any prosecution from him of happening. And then, of course, if you just look at the other people in the Israeli government, there's a lot more extreme elements than Netanyahu. Not that I am in any way saying that, he should remain the president of Israel, or the prime minister of Israel. I guess that's, for the Israelis to decide. Just, you look at somebody who's committing an ethnic cleansing campaign and you think, oh, well, if they replace them, it's only going to get better. I don't think that is the case. Last point to make here is just that the people of Israel being upset with Netanyahu for, I guess, failing to stop the October 7th attack is at least an interesting position to take. And it's good that we're not seeing something like that happened in the US after 9/11, where even though George Bush failed to protect Americans rallied around George Bush. And I think that increased the blank check that the US government had to kill in the days after 9/11, years after 9/11. All right, next up here, Israel will ignore UN Security Council resolution calling for a pause to the fighting in Gaza. The UN Security Council passed a resolution on Wednesday that called for a temporary pause to the fighting in Gaza. Tel Aviv called the call for a short peace was a decision disconnected from reality and holds no significance. The resolution passed the UN's most powerful body on a vote of 12-0. The US and the UK did not vote for the motion because it did not condemn Hamas. Russia abstained over concerns that the resolution did not make a strong enough call for peace. Moscow's representative says Washington is responsible for removing the word ceasefire from the text. Now, few interesting things about that. One, the Russians are making a stronger call for the peace than the Americans and the Brits is just kind of like an interesting propaganda point to kind of throw out there. Usually you assume it would be one to be the other way. Not that, Russia wants world peace or anything like that. I'm not trying to praise Putin too much here, but at least they are calling for peace in this particular situation. And then of course, that the U.S. is still so allergic to the word ceasefire that it had removed from this UN Security Council resolution is pretty important. So the resolution itself called for an urgent and extended humanitarian pauses in Gaza to allow aid to reach Palestinian civilians and for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages held by Hamas and other groups, especially children, as well as ensuring immediate humanitarian access. The Associated Press reports the language of the resolution was watered down. In response to the Security Council passing its first resolution on the war in Gaza, Tel Aviv said it would ignore the call for a humanitarian pause. This is the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. The decision is disconnected from reality and holds no significance. Israeli already operates in Gaza according to international law, while Hamas terrorists will ignore the decision and certainly not act in accordance with it. Israel will continue the actions until the destruction of Hamas and the return of the kidnapped. And so, of course, Israel isn't actually following international law. That it's just, a propaganda point. Tel Aviv has resisted calls for an agreement or even a pause in the fighting. And then I talk about the Vice News reports and what the New York Times report about the Al-Shifa hospital. And of course that the Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz says that even if Tel Aviv agrees to a short pause in operations in Gaza to allow for the hostages exchange, it plans to settle the war with its military. And this is a quote from Gantz. Even if we are required to pause fighting in order to return our hostages, there will be no stopping combat and the war until we achieve our goals. And so this is probably a little problematic for negotiations to go forward. I'm sure that from the Palestinian side, there's probably some hope that establishing the ceasefire can be expanded and can actually, end the Israeli onslaught at this point, where Gantz is saying, I don't even know why you bother to agree to anything because, we're only going to pause fighting for a few days at the most. All right, next up here, this is from Dave DeCamp. Poll, majority of Americans support a ceasefire in Gaza. A new poll from Reuters found that the majority of Americans support the idea of a ceasefire in Gaza, a position that has been rejected by the Biden administration. About 68% of respondents agreed with the statement Israel should call for a ceasefire and try to negotiate, including 3/4 of Democrats and about half of Republicans. The poll is the second in recent weeks to show that the majority of Americans support a ceasefire in Gaza. A poll published by Data for Progress on October 20th found 66% of respondents agreed with the idea of the U.S. calling for a ceasefire and using its leverage to prevent future violence. The Biden administration has called for pauses in the fighting, but has refused to use the term ceasefire as it has been determined to continue backing Israel's brutal assault, which is currently focused on Gaza's biggest hospital. The Reuters polls show that a general decline in U.S. public support of Israel. Just 31% of respondents say they support sending weapons to Israel, while 43% oppose the idea. So that's a pretty significant margin. I have a little bit more polling results here that I had just tweeted out earlier today. So among Americans aged 18 to 34, the poll found that a poll found that 52% said their sympathies lie more with the Palestinians, while only 29% said their sympathies lie more with the Israelis. This is a significant reversal from October, when for the same age range, 41% of voters said they sympathize with the Israelis and only 26% with the Palestinians. In that age group, 66% disapprove of Israel's response to the October 7th attack, and only 20% approve. Overall, 54% of those surveyed say their sympathies lie more with the Israelis, but that is down 7% from October. We also have a group of 24 Democrats, members of Congress, signing a letter and demanding that Biden call for a ceasefire in Gaza. The letter says, "We write to you to express deep concern about the intensifying war in Gaza, particularly grave violations against children, and our fear that an immediate cessation of hostilities and the establishment of robust bilateral ceasefire, this war will lead to a further loss of civilian life and risk dragging the United States into a dangerous and unwise conflict with armed groups across the Middle East. Further, we are writing to urging clarity on your strategic objectives for achieving de-escalation and stability in the region. We share your dire concerns for the ongoing Israeli response, in which the Israeli Defense Forces had killed over 11,000 Palestinians, nearly half of whom have been children. During the past 39 days of hostilities, at least 4,506 children have been killed in the Gaza Strip, and at least 7,695 children have sustained injuries. Additionally, about 3,250 Palestinians in Gaza, including at least 1,755 children, have been reported missing and are presumed trapped or dead under the rubble, awaiting rescue or recovery. During the same time, Israeli forces or settlers have killed 51 Palestinian children in the occupied West Bank. Given the present lack of apparent and clear strategic plan, we encourage redoubling of efforts to achieve rapid de-escalation through a ceasefire and robust regional engagement that includes humanitarian organizations." Betty McCollum, who has been a pretty staunch advocate for the Palestinians, put together the letter. It was signed by members of the Squad and a few other Democrats. I also saw Elizabeth Warren tweeted out a call for ceasefire this morning. All right, everybody, last article here today. Again, we will have more tomorrow. I know I only covered about half of the really important news. I didn't even get to the Biden-Xi meeting, the new sanctions on Russia, everything happening in the West Bank. So again, another show out tomorrow for that stuff. U.S. intercepts drone fired from Yemen near Navy ship. I wrote this up for the Institute on November 15th. The Pentagon reported successfully intercepting a drone that was on trajectory towards a Navy destroyer. The Department of Defense says the attack originated in Yemen and the naval ship was operating near the Red Sea. After Tel Aviv began bombing Gaza last month, the Houthis started targeting Israel with missiles and drones. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. forces shot down a drone targeting the USS Thomas Hurdner. It's Hudner. Sorry, guys. It's a destroyer on Wednesday. The Department of Defense reported that no sailors were injured and the ship was undamaged. The attack is the latest in a series of strikes targeting Israel and a U.S. drone in response to the Israeli military operations in Gaza. On October 19th, the Pentagon claimed it successfully intercepted several drones and cruise missiles that were fired by the Houthis at Israel. The Houthis rose to power in Yemen in 2015 and have resisted a U.S.-Saudi war aimed at dislodging their hold on power in Sana'a. Currently, the Houthis control the territory where most of the Yemeni people live, including the country's northern Red Sea coastline. At the end of October, the Houthis launched several missiles at Israel that Tel Aviv says were intercepted using the Arrow defense system. At the time, a Houthi official said the attacks would continue until Israel ends its war on Gaza. Last week, the Houthis downed a U.S. Reaper drone off the coast of Yemen. Along with Sana'a, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria have targeted American forces in the Middle East over Washington's support for Israel's war in Gaza. American soldiers occupying Iraq and Syria have come under attack dozens of times, causing scores of injuries to U.S. troops. In response, the U.S. has conducted a series of strikes on militia groups in Iraq and Syria. American bombs have also often provoked additional attacks against U.S. forces. The latest U.S. strikes were conducted on Sunday, and within 24 hours, U.S. American troops were attacked at least 4 times. U.S. forces were attacked 3 additional times on Wednesday, bringing the total over the past month to 57. Voice of America, U.S.-funded state media, reported that the strikes were failing to deter attacks on American soldiers. However, on Tuesday, Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh attempted to portray the operations as successful. We've been pretty clear in our message that when it comes to deterrence, and we haven't seen this conflict widen out. And so she's saying that just because these groups haven't, launched a larger attack and they're just, firing the rockets and drones over and over again at the U.S. forces, that this is okay, that deterrence means just keeping it at the same level of hostility, which isn't true. What they're trying to do is prevent these attacks from happening at all. This is just spin. Singh has also attempted to downplay the injuries to U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. Last week, she said, thankfully, none of our troops have been injured seriously, and our infrastructure at our bases that have been targeted, we have not experienced any significant damage. However, at the time, she said that over 50 soldiers have been injured in the attacks, including 25 suffering with traumatic brain injuries. And so just like she's trying to downplay the strikes on American soldiers, she's also trying to downplay their injuries. All right, guys, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, not just for tuning into this show, but for the 500 episodes that I have put together. I appreciate it so much, and your support allows me to keep doing this. And again, make sure you're subscribed somewhere. Make sure you're sharing the show because we are going to have a bonus episode out this week. Thanks, everyone.